Don't believe the hype. Read the type. This is TYPBST.
Take a look, it's in a book. It's TYPBST, baby.
Yo, I think that's the first time for our audio listeners. They can go check out the video of you getting your solo act on in that intro.
Yeah, man. It feels kind of natural. I feel like a young Usher or something like that.
Yeah.
So it feels
It's
good.
all,
Feels good.
you know, it's like you should have serenaded your wife on your wedding day or something.
No. I rapped. I rapped for her. Yeah. Yeah, no, but it's good. It's good to be in video and sing for the people. So hopefully it was good. All right, so this is TYPBST. This is like the segment where Joel and I discuss books that are shaping the way we think. Right, so kind of like we're like, okay, well, where is Joel and I getting these ideas from? So these are the books we're reading that are kind of, or that is actually shaping the way we think. So today we'll be looking at a book called Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. And so the backstory with this book was, it was a book given to me by good friend, my do-gooder, Gideon Boateng. So shout out to Gideon. I went to his house and I was going through his library and I was like, oh, you have Francis Schaeffer, How Shall We Live, which I'm reading and I'm rereading. And he says, hey, you need to check out this Why Liberalism Failed. And he's like, have you heard of it? I'm like, no, I haven't heard of it. He's like, yeah, I saw Patrick Deneen on The Briefing with Al Mohler. And he says, yeah, I heard the interview was really good. I got the book. And he said, and this is how you know, Gideon's a good guy. Gideon didn't read the book. He didn't read the book.
Okay.
But he says, look, like, he has kids, right? He work, he's a busy man, right? He's like, look, I don't have time. I don't have time to read this book. It's a bit weighty. It's a bit weighty. And I'll say that as well. Like, it's a bit wordy, like the way he writes. I don't really like his writing style. The sentence structure is kind of hard to follow, so I have to like reread sentences over again or like look up words. So Gideon didn't read it, but he said, you know what, maybe you'll get something out of it. Not to say he wouldn't, but he's like, you know what, it'll really help you for the podcast and all the work that I'm doing. And so yeah, man, the book really blessed me. And so I'm like, I'm going to share it with you guys, and we can jump into some of the nuances about it. So real quick, I'm just going to read about the author. So Patrick J. Deneen is a professor of political science and holds the David A. Potsenian Memorial College Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. His previous books include The Odyssey of Political Theory, Democratic Faith, and a number of edited volumes.
Yeah, I've got. I'll have him in the show notes, or this book in the show notes page. Usually, I'll use Goodreads.com, so you can also click through to the author, see a bunch of his other works. He's got quite a few. Democratic. Are these his? Yeah, Democratic Faith, Conserving America, Redeeming Democracy, The Odyssey of Political Theory. So pretty broad spectrum of works in terms of time frame too. One of those ones I quoted was from 2000, and then this was published in 2018, I believe. Or at least one of the editions that I'm looking at was 2018. So what for this book, obviously, Gideon gave you a strong impetus to read it. What would you say, or what did you, when you went back to him, what was your first take or first reply to him in terms of this recommendation?
At the CLS reunion barbecue, we talked about it.
Oh, nice.
at Joel's house we had this summer. So yeah, it was fun. It was fun. It was good. It was good to see everybody. It was good to break bread and chat about the good old days. But
Yeah.
yeah. So no, talking. What I said to Gideon was that yeah, no, the book was great, and it the summary was like, okay, now I realize like liberalism can go either way. It could be right wing, it could be left wing, and Christians should definitely be weary of adopting liberalism ideologies, because liberalism isn't liberty, according, like, those are two different things: a Christian perspective of liberty versus a secular perspective. So it was deep. The book was deep. It was helpful.
Would you use the term, like, do you think liberalism, as he refers to it, would align really well or closely with the term some people are throwing around being classical liberal?
Yeah. So the idea of classical liberal, no. So classical liberal would be more like because I would consider myself classical liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not getting into that. Um, so like classical liberal is like small government, free market, that kind of stuff.
Rights.
Rights, yeah, heavy on the right stuff. Yeah, no. So no, he's moving further back. Before you get to classical liberal, he's moving further back, and even then, he goes even further back in regards to Christianity, which I found helpful.
Okay.
Right. So yeah. So yeah.
So in terms of going farther back, then how is he defining liberalism?
Okay, yes. So that's a good question. So Dinan's definition of liberalism is he basically says it's individual autonomy,
Okay.
right? And individual autonomy, and he's starting back, and you guys have to kind of follow me on this one. He's starting back from the Renaissance. So people are like, oh, I missed that class. I missed that class. I'm kind of confused about a timeline. So follow me, but don't lose your grip. Okay. So right now in this era, we're in a postmodern era, right? And then before postmodernism, we have modernism. And then before modernism, we have pre-modernism, which is known as like the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and that's where you kind of find the idea of the Renaissance, and people saying, okay, and this is key. This is key, where people start saying, okay, you know what? Let's separate from this God thing, from this Christianity thing. Like that's when those first conversations started to say, like, yeah, man can be free apart from God. We can be free to reason. And so this is where this the liberalism, the secular idea of liberalism, starts to come to fruition. And I'll also nuance this point as well, because for sometimes it's helpful, especially for our Christian listeners, to put this in context. So for us, right, who the Son sets free is free indeed. So the Christian definition of liberty, the very essence of liberty, is the ability to say no to sin. That's true freedom. That's true freedom. And then giving into sin and choosing sin is not freedom, right? We know this. It's actually slavery. Right. So for us, we go, okay, so that's the on Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. So that's the solid rock we stand on, right? That you're free to say no to sin. Now, the secular perspective is the opposite. True freedom is being able to pick whatever you want. That's true freedom. Christians say, no, that's not true freedom. True freedom is picking what is good. All right.
And I think just for the listener who's knows what classical liberalism, I think a line there would be that there's an aspect of responsibility that goes with rights, and other people's rights are restraining to one another. That sort of is a way to differentiate between that sort of absolute sense of liberty that's the liberalism that you're referring to.
Yes. Also, I just want to add. So Dean, so the main argument book is that liberalism needs not reform but retirement. Right? Needs not reform but retirement. So he's not arguing for right-wing conservative liberal ideas. He's not arguing for that, and nor is he arguing for liberal progressive ideas. He's saying that both ideas are dangerous. Which I was kind of like, oh shoot, wait. Oh, I was like, okay. So the whole time I was reading the book, I was very skeptical. I was skeptical. I was like, okay, where is this going?
You got your stink eye on the whole time.
Yeah. I was like, where is that going? I don't really understand, but I had to like kind of scale through it and keep going through it and arguing through it. But I think I'm kind of understanding where he's going with this. So for the listener, the way the book is structured and the direction we'll be going into, we're only going to hit like 3 points. We're only going to hit 3 points. So the 3 points are, we're going to hit chapter 1, which is about unsustainable liberalism. And then we're going to hit chapter 5, liberalism against liberal arts. And then we're going to jump into the conclusion, liberty after liberalism.
So just for context, would you say the reason you pick these chapters is because they give a good overview of the book, or is it the particular arguments in those chapters that you found the most compelling?
Yeah, so the unsustainable liberalism is pretty obvious. Why it's unsustainable, and kind of unpacking his main argument. But then I was kind of I kind of like hobby horsing for the next segment about liberalism and against liberal arts, and more so liberal arts education, because we always throw that term around. What is the liberal arts? I go to a liberal arts school. What does that even mean? How does liberalism hurt liberal arts? You know, and as an educator, I'm kind of thinking like, okay, sorry, where are you going with this? So that part, and then of course his conclusion, the wrap up, like, okay, what's the solution to this issue? Because to me, it seems like something you can't overcome. Liberalism is just around us. It's just ingrained in the culture. So I don't understand how you can work around it. So I love when people offer solutions. I love it. So I was like, okay, he's thinking deeper than I am. So how do we solve this problem?
Cool.
So yeah.
Cool. All right. So unsustainable liberalism. What is he suggesting of this ideology or principles from the in the Renaissance was unsustainable?
Yes. Okay. So I'm gonna read a quote from the book, and then we'll jump into it. So liberalism's ascent and triumph required sustained efforts to undermine the classical and Christian understanding of liberty, the dismantling of widespread norms, traditions, and practices, and perhaps above all, the reconceptualization of privacy of the individual defined in isolation from arbitrary accidents of birth. With the state as the main protector of individual rights and liberty. And so here he's pointing at the idea of whether you are, and follow me on this one, when he's talking about liberalism, you can either be progressive or you can be conservative. And so he's saying either way, if you're progressive or conservative, you are pushing for more government intervention to defend those rights.
Like it's sort of funky if I'm understanding it correctly, it's like, I want more autonomy by enforcing the things that I think are social in terms of socially conservative or socially liberal. Right. And it's from a liberty perspective and rights perspective, to me, I'm like, well, yeah, of course this is unsustainable. Right. The libertarian side of me is like, okay, yeah, no, I see what he's trying to say, that like, because essentially government is the ultimate violator of your autonomy. And so if you're trying to enforce your autonomy through government, it's unsustainable, because inherently you can't have everybody's autonomy when one set of beliefs is being enforced in order to achieve that autonomy.
Yes. And he said something that was very fascinating to me. He said, like, even like, when you watch US politics, he's saying like, well, there isn't like a party for liberty and one that's not. He's
Mm.
saying he's like both Democrats and Republicans are for liberty,
Mm-hmm.
just different kinds.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, oh shoot. And so for example, like the conservative would say, um, we're gonna push for science and economics. Science and economics are gonna help us to free us. We're going to use science and economics to manipulate resources to help build more freedom for people. And then the progressives are saying, okay, well, we're going to use science to take away the restraints, not just of government intervention, but of nature.
Mm.
So now they're applying it to the human being, as opposed to conservatives are applying the sciences to these resources, nature, and so
Mm.
forth. And then the progressives are saying, "Oh, okay, no, let's apply it to human beings. Let's see if we can uh, change the definition of what it means to be human.
Mm.
Right? People should have the freedom of to euthanasia, abortion, sex change. People should have the freedom to do these things." And so yeah, and so those are the nuances. Both are fighting for freedom, just freedom in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's where my critique of even conservatives and liberals today is the lack of principle that you're drawing out first in order to argue. It's sort of like, oh, what principle can I use as a justification,
Mhm,
as
mhm.
opposed to deriving the argument from the principles.
Right. And so he says that so liberalism has like two fundamental components to it, right? And so he says there's volunteerism, and so volunteerism is the unfettered and autonomous choice of individuals. So basically, people should be free to do whatever they want. And then the other part of it is human separation and opposition to nature. So nature is subject to human conquest, or said differently, um, displaced natural order to what humanity is subject, and later the notion of human nature itself. Right. So human beings are no longer subject to the natural order. And so we can overcome the natural order, we can overcome nature, and human beings will be preeminent. This is humanism, man being at the center of creation.
Which again, when you're trying to liberalism at this time is trying to define things outside of God, well, inherently, what are you going to put at the center? It's
Mhm.
either creation or humans, right? Like I don't know that you would have any other sort of like center of the universe. It's either the creation that you think is, just came about, or
Mhm.
it's the humanity that is unique on this. One of those two things has to be the center.
Yes, and I've been doing a lot of reading over the summer, so this has been a fun study for me, and even as I go into my classes, I'm trying to be better prepared. And I've been reading a book. I don't know if we do a type beast on it, but I read a book called "Explaining Postmodernism: Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault" by Stephen Hicks, which is excellent. And so reading these books side by side helped me connect the dots in regards to um, how we got to this place in liberalism, and why liberalism can never be what Christians want it to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to come back to your point about Christians, similar to what I was saying with regards to the perspective being developed outside of God, right? For us as Christians, well, God is the center, and so our rights or our liberty concept is derived from something else. as opposed to us being the thing that's deriving our liberty principle. But I wanted to jump on a point, not to necessarily discredit the term, but the use of voluntarism. I don't know. I think I've used that term on the podcast before. I would definitely be using it in a different manner than has historically been used, or at least in this context. When I use the term voluntarism, I would use it as a means to say that when transactions are have voluntary engagement by all parties, versus contract or engage scenarios that lack voluntary, engagement. That was sort of the way that I was using that term, and I don't think that that's really what's being referred to here. As you said, unfettered and autonomous choices of individuals. I think the way that I've defined voluntarism can actually come in contact or conflict with that definition, right? Because if my unfettered action results in someone involuntarily being part of the engagement, that's a problem in the way that I was using voluntarism. Yeah. But this use doesn't account for another individual's involvement.
Right.
So again, another reason why I by comparing liberalism with sort of the more libertarian, classical liberal, I can continue to see the chapter of this title being, let's call it, true. So now that we know liberalism is unsustainable, how does that lead to this argument that liberalism actually is against the liberal arts?
Yeah. So the idea with the idea of liberal arts. So he goes to say, liberalism further undermines education by replacing a definition of liberty as an education in self-government, with liberty as autonomy and the absence of constraint. So to be free, liberal, it was an art. So something learned not by nature or instinct, but by refinement and education. And the soul of the liberal arts was the humanities, education, and how to be a human being. Right? So the idea is that the arts were meant to free us, or starting from the presupposition of saying like, okay, human beings are fallen, right? And so we need education to free us, right? And you could say, okay, that was in modernism, that's in the past. So what we're seeing now is that we're starting from the presupposition that we're not fallen. We are already free. So what's the point of education? Well, we use for education to continue to push ourselves to get what we want, to be free. Right? So one is saying, okay, we start off free, we use education to get us free, and then another one is we're already free. So then we could do whatever we want with the education.
So how does liberalism restrain? Because I mean, I as soon as you were talking early, I thought about the Vince Kinsella episode, and he uses the term redeeming liberal arts.
Yeah, redeeming
right?
it. Yeah,
and I just saw some parallels to sort of that conversation, and so how has liberalism been the catalyst or the culprit for why it's in needing of redemption, as he was referring to it?
Sorry, say that again.
So I was saying, I'm speculating a little bit that liberalism is the culprit for why he's saying we need to redeem the liberal arts.
Yes.
And so what is it really that, that let's say that's preventing the liberal arts from going in the direction that he's thinking about it, right? Valuing historical texts and what we can draw out of those, and the I think of like Shakespeare, and what we drew out of those stories was so much about story, and I think of that as so much of the liberal arts, whereas, you know, it's gotten a little bit more into like, you know, and again, I'm thinking of like liberal arts schools. There's almost like a focus on the creatives, and like, you know, liberal arts being sort of almost a means to use for progressives to sort of, you know, show their art, as a horrible word, not actual art, but like art in a greater version, or at a broader concept.
Mhm.
So is that sort of where, you know, what would you say that that's what's being referred to by him, and that we need to redeem it?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I totally understand your question in regards to, yeah, good question. So in the sense of why liberalism failed,
Mm.
right? Kind of according to the book, looking at the book in that way. So for example, um, we're looking at a point in history. So remember how I talked about, we're in postmodern era, and then we move back to the modern era. And so the modern era is known as the Enlightenment, right? And so the Enlightenment, I believe, is from um, the 1400s to the 1800s, I believe. And so what happens is you have that era saying, okay, look, we're done with God. Okay. So that was in the Renaissance, in the Dark Ages. Now we're enlightened, right? Dark Ages in the past. Now we're enlightened. And so there's a bunch of thinkers saying, okay, look, um, we believe in reason. We believe in science. We believe in the free market, Adam Smith. We believe in rights, John Locke, right? Francis Bacon. We believe in the scientific method, right? But then you have guys like Soren Kierkegaard coming out, and Kant saying, okay, well, no, reason isn't helpful. The sciences aren't helpful. They're limiting. And so because, and you follow me. So because um those conservative thinkers like Kant, oh sorry, like John Locke, Francis Bacon, and those guys, because they were using reason, um, but they only started at reason. They didn't start with God. So when the skeptics like Soren Kierkegaard and these guys, who would be considered progressives, they're saying to the conservatives of their time, saying, okay, so why? You explain the how, but explain the why. Right.
Mm.
And these guys, as smart as they are, they couldn't answer the why. The Adam Smiths couldn't answer the why. John Locke couldn't answer the why. The reason why they couldn't answer the why is because they didn't start with God. And so at that point, the skeptics started to win out and beat out the conservative thought of liberty. And so here's where we are today in a postmodern era where um, they've trivialized, they've done away with reason.
Mm.
Right. So I would say, to answer your question, it's a postmodern liberalism that we're seeing today that doesn't have any meaning. We're done with reason. We're done with the sciences. We're done with the humanities. Like, man is the ultimate center. Before, you can make an argument, and the timeline during the Enlightenment was deism. So if you guys are following at home, and I wish I could draw on the screen. I don't know if Anthony can make it happen. I don't know if Anthony can make it happen. So on this side, all right, we got the pre-modern era, and in the pre-modern era we have theism, and then we move over to the middle, which is modernism, the modern era, which is the Enlightenment. Then we get deism, right? And deism is saying, okay, there is a God, but he's not involved in creation. He's like the divine clockmaker. He makes the clock and he removes himself. And now we move into the postmodern. We move into the postmodern era, right? And so with the postmodern era, right, it's agnosticism. Okay, well, forget deism. We just don't know anything. We can never know.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so because the only source of knowing now isn't God, but man, and this is why the liberal arts, liberalism is killing the liberal arts, because the liberalism that we have today, the progressive postmodern idea has made man the center, and so it's this very subjective perspective on school and
Mhm.
education, and it trivializes everything, relativizes everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that definitely makes sense with. I mean, in the past, I've mentioned. I think my pastor brought up the year 2016 was the word of the year was like to post truth,
Mhm.
and a second piece to that was that you've got this. I use the term hyper postmodernism just to, let's say, give credence to the arguments that Russell, I can't remember his name right now. Thaddeus Russell, sorry. Thaddeus Russell would say that postmodernism was more about deconstructing ideas to remove biases. And the idea of objective truth was there, but they felt skeptical about, some authors conveying of that, let's call it objective truth.
Mhm.
And I use the term hyper postmodernism, again, based on what Thaddeus Russell's sort of said, that the people who reject objective truth are hyper postmodernists. So not only do they question the ability to convey an objective truth, they just deny the existence of it altogether.
Mhm.
And so, I really see when you said postmodern classical or postmodern liberalism, that's sort of what went through my head in terms
Mhm.
of, yeah, think about it. Nothing is true. It's all relative. It's all, here's what people thought,
Mhm.
take what you will from that. And so, when you take the arts and the historical writings, the way that you're going to view those things is purely based on relativism, as opposed to, if we take a
Yeah.
Christian common grace approach, where like these works of art, whether they be, writing, music, whatever, these works of art reflect the glory of God imperfectly.
Mhm.
And so, what can we pull from these things and with a much different perspective, right? It's a whole totally different mindset when you view things with that, common grace, whether believer, unbeliever, doesn't necessarily
Right.
matter in terms of the creation providing glory to the creator.
Right. Right. And then again in the book, yeah, he has this point where he says liberalism further undermines education by replacing a definition of liberty as an education in self-government with liberty as autonomy and the absence of constraint. Right, the absence of constraint.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, good, good. All right, so let's move on to the last point: liberty after liberalism.
Sounds good. I think the point you just made resonates perfectly with what I was saying before too, regarding like moving away from liberty of self-governing to liberty of self-autonomy. I think that's a really good differentiation,
Mhm.
especially when
Mhm.
we talk about rights and classical liberalism. So,
Yeah.
what does liberty after liberalism look like, or is this chapter about how do we demonstrate to the public what liberty truly is when we live in a, let's call it, post liberalism world?
Yeah. Um, well, so what he would say is we have to be countercultural, right? So he's saying that he has a quote and he says, um, while culture is cultivated and passed on in the most immediate way in households, it is developed in and through a community of families and centers especially on rituals surrounding earth, coming of age, marriage, and death. Culture takes into account local circumstances, often drawing sustenance and inspiration from facts of a local geography and history. It passes memory down through generations via story, um, like song, not the sort of package in Hollywood or on Madison Avenue, but arising from voices in particular places. And as the word suggests, it is nearly always going to cult, quote unquote, understanding the local to be bound, and ultimately an expression of the universal and eternal, the divine and the sublime. So in a sense, it kind of sounds like he's saying, okay, well, um, we got to do something. We got to have an idea that transcends culture, that has a different way of living, that's not necessarily heavily dependent on liberalistic schools of thought, right? So you kind of have to start your own way of living, or your own way of going about things, that isn't necessarily dependent on um, necessarily having the individual being the center of everything.
Mm.
Like there has to be some sort of community, as opposed to just having just the individual, but having community, and not just having community, but also having transcendent ethics within that community. And to me, it sounds like he's talking about Christianity. Um, now,
Mhm.
Patrick Deanon, he is a Catholic, but I will say that this book isn't religious at all, and it isn't heavy theologically. Like you
Mm.
really have to kind of like really squint and be patient for him to bring up some kind of Christian theology, Christian ideas. So he doesn't even say it's Christianity is the answer. It's not that kind of book. He's not that kind of writer, but you can kind of make the connections.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, and I was gonna say, that idea of like cult or community. You gave the example of like this being sort of like, oh, I think he's talking about Christianity, and I would say that Christianity demonstrates those things, right?
Hmm.
Like many religions, especially the religions that have sort of a cultural nature to it, or sorry, community basic basis to them,
Hmm.
will have this, right? So it's not just Christianity, but I think um, in terms of the application, obviously the content is where maybe it aligns a little bit more with Christianity. Um, but I think what I found peculiar about the quote sort of is he's touching on that word cult, right? Just
Hmm.
a bit, and um, not even. And it was funny until I was hearing this quote, the idea of like cult in connection with culture,
Hmm.
and sort of taking away a little bit of the stigma that we use with the word for cult, because I think I would almost argue that cult is, I want to use the word amoral, but that's not necessarily the right term. The idea that like a cult itself isn't inherently bad. It's generally speaking, things that are cult-ish have, behaviors that are problematic. But I mean, I think a really
Uh,
good example of that word being used in the way that I'm sort of referring to it is like the term cult classic regarding a movie,
hmm.
right? Like it has a cult following, but there's nothing, bad about that. There's no, but what normally we associate the word cult with, like maybe occult, is probably the where our mind goes with
Hmm.
that word. So yeah, it was just an interesting piece when you start to realize, well, what is a cult, and how much is that really different than just cultivating culture within a community.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
No, because I was going to add that the idea of a cult, there's also a good thing about a cult, and that it's separate from culture. It's separate from society.
mm,
It's doing something different. But we talked about in the past, subsidiarity, right? The economic principle of subsidiarity, where the help comes from the grassroots level. It's coming from the home. It's coming from the individual rather from the top down, and that people that are on the in the grassroots level are actually making the change. They're not going to the government to say, hey, look, this is a grassroots movement that's going to stand on your lawn and protest for you to give us funding. Right, it's not that kind of grassroots. It's grassroots saying, okay, look, we're going to stay independent, and we're going to continue helping people independently, um as this organization. And so he has a section here that I just found, and he says this. The advent of Christianity and its development in the now largely neglected political philosophy of the Middle Ages, also known as the Dark Ages, also known as the pre-modern era, emphasized the dignity of the individual, the concept of the person, the existence of rights and corresponding duties, the paramount importance of civil society and a multiplicity of associations, and the concept of limited government as the best means of forestalling the inevitable human temptation toward tyranny. Liberalism's most basic appeal was not its rejection of the past, but its reliance upon basic concepts that were foundational to the Western political identity. Right. And so what it sounds like he's saying is like, yeah, like going back to the essence of what liberty actually is and the foundation that Christianity laid, and that throughout history, getting to the point of the Renaissance when they started to separate from the church and from God. Now you're in a place where like, okay, we're just gonna, when you get to the Enlightenment, okay, we're just gonna use reason, and we're gonna come to the idea of we can still be free apart from God. We can just use our own reason and rely on reason. Right. But then the skeptics are coming along within the Enlightenment and they're giving pushback. They're like, well, reason's not enough. Reason can't get the job done. Reason is not enough to rely on. Right. And so now we have like the idea of these ideas being relative and man being the ultimate center of life. And so, and I guess, and this is where his complaint is, because both perspectives are individualistic. They're still looking for the state to come in and give support and defend each, progressive or conservative. They're both doing the same thing, right? They're both lobbying to the government to say, hey, look, protect our rights, not their rights. Right. And so he's saying, okay, well, look, there has to be a different way, another way where there can be change, but it has to be from the grassroots level. It can't be another organization saying, hey, I got a better idea, only if the government would support it.
No, and I mean, I think, to me that perspective resonates a lot with why we even do this show, right? Like the one liner that I've always said is like, I hate politics, but I love ideas, right? And so much of why we do this is like having a conversation about ideas, which supersedes any sort of political action, because it's the culture and the those principles that people have. And then, the idea, again, obviously for me, I'm very much in line with this, right? Like whether that's through community, or your church community, or the way that you school your children, right? All of those things play into the culture. And so, I've said this for, and I don't know how necessarily true this is, because I'm biased to my own upbringing, but I wonder how much like my parents' generation and their parents' generation sort of took the responsibility of educating their children for granted, because it was a luxury that it was provided for you, and to the point where, like, maybe the extent for the Christians, a lot of Christians, was like, okay, I'm intentional about putting my kid in Sunday school, but I don't really need to worry about taking responsibility for my kid's education. That's already taken care of. And the reason I bring all that up is coming back around now, like, at least I would say my generation, I've seen, at least I'm perceiving it as like, there's a little bit more of like, I want to be intentional about how my kids are raised, what the education they're receiving is, being, a little bit more intentional about involving yourself in the upbringing, and, from an educational perspective. And to me, that's sort of, aligning with what he's calling for. as a means to really move past. And I would say he's perfectly describing the divide. And I would say for a lot of our Christian listeners, you know, how much is he, like, I would say check yourself. How much is what he describing how you think we should solve problems with the conservative government or with, the Christian Heritage Party or whatever, party you're appealing to? How much is he actually describing the approach that you've been taking?
Right. Yeah. And so, it was very helpful, and I really appreciate the fact that he was arguing for both sides and showing where both sides fail, where both conservatives fail and liberals fail on the issue. So I thought that was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. So, what's your 2 cents? What do you want to leave the listener with respect to, liberalism and liberty?
Yeah. So for example, okay, the book is called "Why Liberalism Failed," right? And his answer is that the reason why it failed is because it wasn't meant to succeed. That's the answer he gives. Liberalism was not meant to succeed. And so he goes on to say, the human appetite is insatiable, and the world is limited for both of these reasons. We cannot be truly free in the modern sense. We can never attain um, um, satisfaction, and will be eternally driven by our desires rather than satisfied by their attainment. So he's basically saying, um, we can never attain true liberty because, right, we have an insatiable appetite, we have limited resources, and it cannot be satisfied. Theologians or the scriptures teach that God has put eternity on our hearts, and we were designed for fulfillment in the eternal. And so these limited things that we have around us can't satisfy us in that way. But what I would say is that humans without the true definition of liberty, which is freedom in Christ, those who seek liberation apart from true liberty, which is freedom in Christ, will find various forms of enslavement. Right? Now, as for the book, I would definitely recommend it. But the sentence structure is in the vocabulary. It's kind of hard to follow where he's going. So sometimes you have to read a sentence 3 or 4 times to get what he's getting at. I read this and I was still kind of fuzzy, and then I read Explaining Postmodernism, and I read Francis Schaeffer, How Should We Then Live? So after reading those 2 and giving more of a historical context on, again, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, these kind of ideas, and you start connecting the dots. Then when I came back to this, then everything came to life, and I was like, oh, okay, now I understand who these people are and what these terms mean, and these eras, and what was going on at these points in time in history. But I would recommend the book. Just be sure you don't. I would say you don't have to read it necessarily cover to cover. If you buy it, don't do that. Just read it to get the answers you want answered. So you can go to the back and use the index and look up a particular idea or person, and then just read about what he has to say about them. Just treat it that way. But to read it from cover to cover, it's a lot. It's a lot to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think, my takeaway from this conversation and for the listener is that, it actually reminds me a little bit of this. So when I was in school, there was this course called History of Economic Thought. And this course was sort of had a legacy when you were doing like an economics major or specialist, that like this was a little bit of a course you had to cut your teeth on, in the sense of it was a tough course, a lot of writing, a lot of learning, because you're learning the history of ideas good ones and bad ones. If I give an example, cost labor or sorry, labor theory of cost versus marginal price theory sort of is an example of what we used to believe and then what became, so thinking through those ideas was what this course did, right? What ideas were in the past, where did we go? And what was peculiar was that, my prof was telling me as I was in this course that all of the old profs, as they were, basically retiring, nobody was around to teach this course anymore. And I just see this like weird resemblance in this context of like not understanding the origin of ideas. Right? So like even as we're going through this conversation, I'm learning from you what liberalism really meant. Like what that word historically meant. What were the ideas associated with that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it's sort of similar when we talked about Abraham X. Kennedy's book, right? Going to the original sources, going to the original principles, reading those ideas. What were they saying? And really trying to decipher it.
Mm-hmm.
Just the value in that, right? So again, drawing the parallel to my course, right? Like I saw the value in it in terms of, bad ideas eventually will be debunked. And so learning what were the ideas we had and where have we come, and some of that in this case with liberalism would be an aspect of like, where did our ideas go wrong, assuming you're, of the
Yeah.
agreeing with him in
Yeah.
terms of the premise of his book. So I think both understanding ideas but also defining terms, because I think you could easily take what his book is, if you take it at a very surface level, totally not understand
Mm-hmm.
what liberalism he's talking about if you
Right.
just use a conventional use of the term and have no interest
Yes.
in
Yeah. Because
understanding different
yeah,
meanings.
and I think like for example, like he threw liberalism. Like automatically, I was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like classical liberalism, libertarianism, right? And so
Trudeau's party.
right, yeah, right. Like so yeah, like Trudeau's party, and so like the idea is like, okay, well, again, like my takeaway was like I have to take a step back of the word liberty, call myself a classical liberal. I gotta take a step back, or use the term in nuance, or if I call myself a libertarian, I'm like, okay, well, hold on, like, what do you mean? What does that mean to be a libertarian? What does that even mean? Not to say that there is no definition for it, but I'm just saying like it's good to reevaluate. Just like when I read David Koizi's book. After I read that book, I was like, oh shoot, I'm not gonna call myself a conservative anymore. I'm not gonna call myself a conservative anymore. After reading this, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna call myself a libertarian anymore. I think
I need a new term.
I think I'm gonna use my Joel card, my Joel Nikoloff card.
I don't like labels.
You know what that card is?
Darnell, what's my card when we talk about theology?
Yeah. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna use my Joel card. So when it comes to economic theory, Joel likes labels. When it comes to theology, Joel doesn't like labels, right? So I'm gonna do the reverse, right? So I'm like, when it comes to political theory, I'm not gonna use labels. When it comes to theology, I'll use labels. So as far as being called a conservative, I'm not using that term. Being called a liberal, I'm not using that term no more, man. That's my takeaway from the book. I'm not using those terms unless I'm going to sit there and define the terms with the person, and take matters case by case.
Yeah. No, I totally resonate with that. That's sort of why I say, why I was defining the term voluntarism, because I had essentially tried to use this term as a way to like opt out of labels, but try to come up with a term that, on a very simple sense, will give you a principle that how would Joel think about this, right? Voluntary, voluntary interactions, right? So, I definitely know where you're coming from, because, even listen to this and liberalism and hashing that out, sort of going like, to some extent, I almost want to say I'm more confused about what do these terms mean because so many people use them in different ways.
Yeah, but the essence is this, and I don't want I hate when hopefully my listeners or my students walk away confused. I don't want anybody walking away confused. Just know this, that liberty and liberalism is not the same thing. Liberty, right? Of course, we know as Christians is freedom to choose what is right, and that's the true essence of freedom. And then liberalism, the suffix at the end of the word of liberal, freedom, ism, the ism at the end of a liberalism, that suffix, right, makes the word a philosophy. It's just a philosophy on freedom, right? And that's a part, and that's like a derivative from the Christian term liberty. Right. And so now we're into the philosophy. And from my study of the history of thought, things get screwed up as soon as we get to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment thinkers are saying, okay, look, we don't need God. We can reason these things on our own. And the idea was that you thought that the conservative Enlightenment thinkers, Adam Smith, right, known as the father of economics, John Locke, right, father of rights and property rights, right, Francis Bacon, the father of the scientific method, right, like all these guys, they're giants, like these are principles Joel, me and you agree with these guys. We agree with these guys. So here's the key question: how did those guys lose to skeptics if they're so smart? How did they lose to the skeptics? Right? No. I have the answer. No, I don't. I have the answer.
You have the answer?
I have the answer. It's a rhetorical question, man. Right? The reason why they lost is because they stopped short of God. Right? Again, they were able to explain the how. Scientific method. All right, let me show you what that looked like. Property rights. I'll break that down. The boom bust cycle. Okay, I can break that down. Okay, you showed us how, but why? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? We need to know the why. And they weren't able to do that. And so at that point, that's when the skeptics started to find the holes in their theory. Right? And they couldn't respond. Right? So their ideas were great, and they help us today. But they were deficient. It wasn't complete. And so this is why we're here, and this is why they lost. This is why liberalism failed. This is why conservative thought continues to fail, because conservative thought is not biblical thought. Conservative is only conserving what they choose to conserve at the time. That's why I don't call myself a conservative. What are you conserving? Right? You can have conservatives who are pro-choice. Right? So what are we talking about? Right? So this is why it's important as a Christian to make sure that you're able to make the distinctions, to know when to vote and when not to vote, when to jump on the bandwagon, when to jump off the bandwagon. But that just because something's conservative doesn't make it biblical, right? And just because something's liberal doesn't mean it's biblical.
I think, you haven't really touched on this, but to some extent, the underlying undertone is with God. You're taking I have an objective standard for my perspective. Now, some people would discredit that objective standard, but at least there is an objective standard. With everything else, there is no objective standard.
And even if they try to, it's limited.
Well, and this is my point, that it can, like your point about the skeptics. What do the skeptics do? They appeal to relativism, and there's no rebuttal when you don't have an objective standard, right? Like that, you might try to claim something objective, right? Nobody can dismiss the Bible and a Christian worldview based on relativism. No, you can dismiss that you don't believe it's an objective standard. You could argue why you think that using it as an objective standard is foolish, but you can't dismiss it, right? Like you have to argue against that objective standard.
Right.
Whereas when you lack an objective standard, when you have relativism as part of the discourse, then you get stuck in really no sort of solid foundation that you can go back and appeal to, like you get stuck in this minutia argument of relativism. And arguably this is, I would say, how we end up in an era of post-truth, because when it's relativism, there is no such thing as objective standards, objective truths.
Right. And yeah, totally. And so I think it's important, hence, like you said, it's important, and it's blessed me to study the history of this thought. And as I teach it to my students and help them to think through, like, okay, how did we get here? Right? Right? Francis Schaeffer, right? How should we then live? Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How should we live? How should we then live? Okay, let's follow the thought backwards. Let's follow the train of thought. Let's do a reductio ad absurdum. Let's reduce our thoughts to its finest point of absurdity to see what these ideas are made of and how we got here, and learning from the past on where these guys failed. Why did the conservatives fail then, and why are they failing now? Okay, well, there's a common thread there. So this book, Why Liberalism Failed. Thank you, Gideon Tang. Thank you, man. Thank you, brother. This book really blessed me, and I hope it blessed the listeners. I hope you were blessed by it, Joel.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this conversation has definitely refined my thinking a little bit. Even the term of using the term voluntarism, I'm sort of like, oh, that one got co-opted. Now I gotta find something else that's, like you said, I'm not a big fan of labels, even in the political sphere. I tend to use them, but I don't like them because they box you in at the end of the day. And I think this is a great example of the conversation where sometimes you can get boxed in based on someone's false interpretation of what you meant, because there is some ambiguity. And I think that's where, when I say I'm even more confused, I don't mean I'm more confused on the conversation. I'm more confused when someone calls themselves a liberal, or, liberalism, if they're following liberalism. It's like, I don't know what you mean by that. Right. And that's where I would say my confusion sort of increased, in that these terms, I'm even less sure what somebody means when they say, oh, I'm a liberal. And just another reason to define terms when you're in these type of conversations.
For all you guys on Buy Me a Coffee, we really appreciate you. If you have any questions or comments, we can unpack some of these ideas any further. So we'd love to hear from you. You know how to get in contact with us. And remember, don't believe the hype. Read the type.
Madden and Mitchell Media.